So our speaker today is Dan Bouk. He teaches history at Colgate University in upstate New York. He's the author of Democracy's Data, which is one of New York Times 100 notable books for 2022. I've read it, I enjoyed it. Highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. So we are just about at time, so I'm going to disappear and let Dan get started.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you too for that recommendation. When I think of people who might read this book, I'm excited that someone with your expertise could really enjoy it. I want to thank everybody here who's on this call with us today, especially those of you who are saying you're watching from sunny and warm spaces. To have left those sunny, warm spaces to join us on this Zoom call, I really appreciate that. The last time Elizabeth and I were together on these video screens was doing a presentation together for the National Archives for one of their wonderful events. And I'm pleased that I can join the Genealogy Center and all these impressive programs that you're all putting together here. So let me now get my slides running so we can all see what's happening here. Now, I believe that many of you in the audience today are very familiar with images like this one. This is a census record from 1940. When I began writing this book, Democracy's Data, the 1940 records were the most recent materials available from the federal census. In April of this year, that all changed. I guess last year. No, we're almost in April again. And a whole new world of mysteries and revelations awaits us for those of us who are already, I'm sure, digging into the 1950 census records. For today, I want to stay planted in 1940 to tell the story of those census records. Now, you heard me right, and you maybe are wondering what's happening here. I will be telling the story of these records. This is not the ordinary way of doing things, I'll grant you that. For those of you who research the histories of your families or your communities or some other entity, like the nation at large, census records are usually a means to an end. They're not the end themselves. They reveal to you some clues or even facts about those who you seek to better understand. Today, I ask you to take a different approach to the census. Join me in an investigation of the census as a knowledge-making process, a vast continent-spanning process, in fact, one that was intended to generate reliable, stable, and legitimate facts that Americans and their government could use to live, plan, and to govern. So, while I will present a number of individual stories today, and we'll look closely at some census records, we will mostly be concerned with the bigger picture, the larger social, political, and technical process that generated census records. As we look at census records this afternoon, we will consider them as byproducts of that knowledge-making enterprise. They are almost like the waste that is left behind by America's factory of facts. Yet we know that they are so much more than that. Like, we know that, right? That they are valuable today for the glimpses that they give us into the past lives and households and neighborhoods of people and communities that we're interested in. And as I will show you today, even during the 1940 census, the meaning and uses of these census records changed and was changing. Here's a depiction of that factory of facts that I pulled out of the National Archives materials from the 1940 US Census. You can see that it was a big operation, such that these folks sitting at their desks are raising their hands up in frustration. Look at all this paperwork that I've got to deal with. So I will tell you a story today about the 1940 census records, which turns out to raise some big and enduring questions about what we owe to each other and what government owes to each of us, about the limits to privacy and the sources of identity, and at its most fundamental level, about what it means to be a whole person, a complex, multifaceted individual in a sprawling and diverse democracy. In preparation for the 1940 count, the Census Bureau urged people to cooperate. Like, that was it, cooperate. Incredibly, for our ears, cooperate was an actual slogan. Consider the iconography here. This was these stamps that they used to advertise the census, with an Uncle Sam figure filling in names on a scroll, making a list of every American. When a human enumerator, census taker, came to the door, he or she, it was most likely a he in 1940, but just barely. Anyways, when he or she came to the door, that enumerator came in the name of Uncle Sam, in the name of the nation. To know America, the Census Bureau explained, tell America. And America would appear on your doorstep in the guise of a neighbor, one selected via a series of tests and with the approval of members of Congress from the party in power. The Bureau had another turn of phrase that made a similar point, but I think with a little bit more poetry. You cannot know your country unless your country knows you. So this was the bargain. Reveal your personal information, and in return, you and your community and your state and your country can better know itself and govern itself. So if we look back at the census sheet, we should recall that it is a digitization of a microfilmed photograph of a large paper form. This staged photograph here of the film star Tyrone Power with an enumerator gives us a sense of the actual size of these sheets. The enumerator received a whole sheaf of these large papers, along with a similarly large leather portfolio for carrying them around. The papers were ready to be filled in, but they were not blank. They already bore markings from the Bureau, questions, categories, instructions, many of which had been decided at a special conference held early in March in 1939. One of the people in attendance at that conference was Margaret Scattergood, identified here on a census sheet as a researcher for a labor union. She was, in fact, a researcher for the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which she would later describe as meaning that she did for the nation's unions what the CIA did for the national government. The AFL's president, William Green, sent Scattergood in his stead to represent their interests. She was joined as well by two representatives from the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, which represented the mass of everyday workers, those who were outside of the traditional skilled trades. Scattergood probably commuted into DC that morning from her home, a large, elegant house in the Virginia countryside. She would have arrived by around 10 a.m. if all went according to plan, at a massive, monumental building, the product of 60,000 tons of Indiana limestone and Connecticut granite, roofed by 6 acres of terracotta tiles. When the Commerce Department building first opened its doors in 1932, a Washington Post headline read, "Size of building baffles writers." I don't know why one admits that. 8 years later, Scattergood would have passed through the large Greek columns that greeted her and moved into the Commerce Department auditorium to find the rest of those who were there for that special conference. Scattergood was quite well off, but she was not rich. Not so rich as the rest of the men, and they were almost exclusively men, who convened that day to determine the 1940 census questions. I can say that about the wealth of Scattergood and the other men because they were asked a question about their incomes by census takers, and almost every one of them reported making $5,000 or more, so 5,000 plus, which was a particular kind of imprecision that was allowed to the wealthy to save them the embarrassment of admitting their full true income to an enumerating neighbor. Scattergood, for her part, earned the handsome sum of $4,000 a year. Compared to most Americans, that made her very comfortable in the top 2.5% of all Americans and the top 1% for women. The average income of the time was about $1,000. So 4,000 was very good. Scattergood is listed in the census as white, as were all of the other attendees at the conference. The director of the census at the time, William Lane Austin, had raised the possibility of including on the Population Census Advisory Board a single African-American representative, the president of the Tuskegee Institute, Dr. Frederick Douglass Patterson, but Austin and his superiors deemed it, quote, not essential at this time. Now, as these data portraits illustrate, the auditorium on that March 1939 day was filled by Census Bureau staff and also officials representing the growing, what I call the ABCs of government agencies, the administrations like the Veterans Administration, the boards like the Social Security Board, and the commissions like the Tariff Commission. There were the titans of business who attended and made their marks, as well as the professional brains from the worlds of academia and philanthropy. And of course, there was Scattergood and her ilk. These folks set the priorities for the nation's count. Questions about immigration and national origin had dominated census sheets, taking up much of the space since the late 19th century. But anti-immigration laws, after debates that drew on those census figures, substantially decreased migration to the United States between 1870 and 1930. And the question men who gathered in 1939 had new priorities. The businessmen worried more about identifying sources of demand, and labor, too, worried about getting firm figures on the purchasing power of their constituents. A census official called the 1940 census an inventory of democracy. And indeed, it had a much greater economic bent, economic focus than had earlier censuses, reflecting the realities of the Depression and the way that Roosevelt's New Deal had invested heavily in the idea that government, working with organized labor and big business, had a responsibility to improve the economic lives of Americans. Their priorities took shape as a pre-printed blank form, almost one half of which was now devoted to economic topics. So you hear that, so you can see highlighted in blue there is how much of this, and really even almost more than half, if we also include the part about where did you live 5 years before this, which was in its way an economic question, concerned about the extent to which there was different forms of migration within the United States because of the Depression and similar factors shaping the United States in the 1930s. So you cannot know your country unless your country knows you. To know America, tell America. These were the slogans. The people who were in the room decided what individuals had to tell, and thus in what way the United States could be known, and also the way that we can know people, like looking back on these sheets. So now you may have noticed something about Margaret Scattergood's census record. In the column under relation, Scattergood is listed as partner. Florence Thorne, with whom she worked and with whom she shared her home, appears in the census record as head of household, and May Stotts Allen is listed as maid to Thorne, defined in this case by her servile status. In early 2020, two reporters from the Washington Post investigated Thorne and Scattergood's story because their house, the house they lived in at this time, had been repurposed. It now serves as the Scattergood-Thorne Conference Center on the campus of the CIA's Langley headquarters. The reporters Jessica Contrera and Jillian Brockle learned about the partner label in the 1940 census, and they pondered its meanings. Did it imply a romantic or intimate attachment, as the term often does these days, or did it have some other connotations? They interviewed surviving relatives who did not believe that the two were romantically involved. Of course, it might have been a well-kept secret from a time when lesbian relationships were frequently taboo. There's no evidence that that was true one way or the other. Still, I would call this a queer household because queer denotes a way of living that transgresses, that goes against the norms of a straight family, which in America looked like a male head of household, a female wife, and possibly children. The partner label made it possible to count people who did not live in such families, which is to say, who did not live in a straight patriarchal family, the kind that the question men in DC had planned for. The theorist of nationalism, Benedict Anderson, says, the fiction of the census is that everyone is in it, that everyone has one and only one extremely clear place. Partners like Margaret Scattergood were folks who didn't have an extremely clear place. Now, looking at the entire manuscript census for the 48 states in 1940 through a database maintained by IPMS USA, it became clear to me that partners came in clumps in the United States Census. So here's a data visualization prepared for me by the data scientist Stephanie Jordan. The bigger the circles, the larger the number of partners enumerated. And then the shading indicates what percentage of the population showed up as a partner. At the national level in 1940, partners were rare. They were less than 1% of the number of spouses, which meant effectively wives, and only about 0.15% of the total population. Yet, as this map shows, in some places, up to 6 or 7% of all people enumerated would be enumerated as partners. Supposing we say, paraphrasing Tolstoy, that every normal household is the same, every peculiar one is peculiar in its own peculiar way. In New York's Greenwich Village, partners tended to be unmarried individuals living with a person of the same sex, so in a situation kind of like Margaret Scattergood. In Harlem, by contrast, so going a little bit north in Manhattan, the typical partner was married, just not to the person who they lived with. Many of these individuals had moved north as part of the Great Migration of African Americans, separating them by choice or by necessity from a spouse. On Manhattan's Upper East Side, so now moving east and a little bit south, partners were also likely to be migrants, but not from the US South. Instead, they came from Europe. The partners of San Francisco vary too from neighborhood to neighborhood in ways that we could talk about. One of the hottest spots for finding partners was in the larger American empire, in the territory, not yet a state, the territory of Hawaii, where census enumerators found themselves trying to count the workers who made the future state's vast plantations work. Partners in Hawaii were particularly likely to be Filipino men doing the hardest plantation tasks and living in groups in work camps. This group of partners here that you see before you, in contrast, was pulled from a Works Progress Administration road repair gang. And it includes here a divorced Puerto Rican, a widowed Black man from Kentucky, a widowed Puerto Rican, and a white Canadian, all living together in one household, living beside Chinese, Native Hawaiian, Mexican, and Filipino workers. But in order to figure out how to this kind of a household, how it can be counted, the partner becomes a really useful and powerful label to find that one and only one place for these folks. Now, you won't find evidence of these partners as partners in the final printed census results. After all the census sheets returned to Washington, D.C., a team of editors, possibly like the people we see pictured in this room. You can see that the Census Bureau at this moment is also segregated, so all the workers in here are African American. They would code every partner with the same code used for lodgers or roommates. And then another worker, here like this woman, would punch each partner's info into a card, transforming each of those partners into a lodger. So we might ask, like, why bother with all of these partners in the first place? I think the answer is that a partner label gave some people, some communities, and some enumerators a way to make sense of a person, a way to make them fit into a household in a way that the person or the enumerator could understand. But once that was done, the Census Bureaus and editors and tabulator no longer needed the partner label. To know America, it was useful to tell America, I'm a partner. But that never became part of the larger story of the nation, at least not until now. The partner label was officially sanctioned, even if it was not exactly encouraged for use in the field. But a close study of the census sheets reveals that people, the counters, and those who were counted, often colored outside of the prescribed lines. The documents, as I'm sure many of you have figured out as you've looked through these records, reveal to those who know where to look for it, sweeping conflicts, even in some cases, international intrigue. So consider the sheets filled out in a neighborhood of Houston, Texas, by an enumerator named Anne G. Robinson. One day in early May, after weeks of enumerating, Robinson passed into a new section of town. In Cashmere Gardens, you see it says here ends Cashmere Gardens, and Robinson had filled out the race category with almost all W's, meaning she deemed the inhabitants to be white. In Englewood, the first person she enumerated was Mary Sheffield, whom Robinson classified as, quote, Negro, the official census term for African Americans. She also began writing repeatedly MEX, as in this record from the Diaz family. Perhaps the Diazes thought of themselves as racially Mexican, or maybe in the Jim Crow South, where segregation was legally enforced and deadly serious, Robinson could not fathom that the people with Mexican roots living in a mixed-race neighborhood who she was looking at, that they could possibly be white. But according to the Census Bureau, officially they were. Officially, they were white. In 1930, the Bureau had briefly instituted a Mexican racial category. The move had terrifying consequences at a moment when, in the throes of the Great Depression, the United States deported thousands of Mexicans and Mexican Americans and agreed with Mexico to send south hundreds of thousands of Mexican Americans, many of whom were even U.S. citizens, in what was called a repatriation program. In this context, by 1935, it looked as though the census racial categorization, creating this Mexican racial category, might cause a cascade of legal and bureaucratic consequences, cementing a distinct Mexican race and justifying the erosion of Mexican Americans' rights and claims to full U.S. citizenship. In that context, local advocates sought help across the border. The Mexican government agreed to step in, insisting that the United States remove the Mexican racial label. Henceforth, Mexican Americans would be white. That meant Robinson's racial labels could not stand. An editor in DC, as we can see here, put a line through each Mex. So you can see it there. There's a line right through each one, and instead wrote a 1, which was the code, the numerical code for white, the 1940 census's default race. In the published figures, no racial Mexicans were to appear. This was a crucial victory for many Mexican Americans in the United States in a moment before the great changes that made possible by the civil rights movement. Those changes made it possible for the visibility of non-white racial groups to lead to better representation and greater political influence. The fight over the Mexican racial category lingers, though, on sheets of paper like this one, where individuals were supposed to tell America so that America might be known. It was the income question, chosen by Scattergood and the other question men, that led to a very public census fight in 1940. which was not coincidentally an election year, a presidential election year. A Republican senator from New Hampshire saw an opportunity to take a crack at sitting President Roosevelt, and also to undermine Roosevelt's vision for a more interventionist US government, one that needed to know precisely the wage income of every American. We can see possible traces of the ensuing fight in the manuscript census, again, if we know where to look. So these here before you are the census records left behind by Ray and Florence Dowd from Indiana. They indicate that Ray worked as a barber and Florence as a grocery clerk. On the far right-hand side, we see that the couple reported working a total of 60 hours a week, but in the prior year had earned $0 in wages. Now, that could be true. If each claimed to have been self-employed, working in census parlance on their own account, then they would have had no wages. But that designation of own account is missing here. We don't know what they were claiming. And the reason that I looked at these records gives us some other reason to think differently about the sheet. So this is a drawing that Florence sent to that New Hampshire senator who was fuming about a snooping census. Before a census enumerator ever appeared at her door, Florence imagined her response. She did not think of the census taker as Uncle Sam, come to her to help her understand her country. She saw him as a peeper. He and she had a pair of brass toes, which was something I had never heard of before, perfectly suited for kicking the census taker right in the rear. The census sheets make no mention of metal footwear, and they bear no trace of physical violence. But those zeros seem newly suspicious. They look like a form of resistance, like an assertion of privacy, and similar suspicious zeros show up all over the 1940 census record. As the Census Bureau pressed individuals to give up more sensitive information, such as concerning their income, the Bureau emphasized a relatively new pledge to keep individual answers confidential. They further insisted that no census responses could be used to harm an individual, that census responses could not be used to determine how much to tax a person, how much they should pay, or to send an individual to war. The census could only be used to generate aggregate figures, to know America statistically, tell America confidentially. The war in Europe and Asia, already a world war by 1939, put new pressures on the Census Bureau and made those promises and that idea of the Bureau's mission much harder to maintain. After the war, a Census Bureau official named Iwao Moriyama, a Japanese-American vital statistician with a PhD from Yale, would look back and explain that the most essential commodity for the prosecution of the war was people. People to fight the war, people to produce war material, and the people to whom critical material had to be diverted for the production of civilian goods. The government, therefore, needed accurate and up-to-date statistics about the population to win the war. It turned out, however, that government also needed and desired a great many details about small groups or about individuals. As war loomed in 1941, the drive to mobilize American resources to fight instigated a temporary transformation of the Census Bureau. For the next few years, the Bureau would churn out personal, individual data alongside facts about the nation. In May 1940, President Roosevelt called on American factories to serve as, quote, the great arsenal of democracy. But he and his administration worried about sabotage or spies, and so they required that all workers in defense industries should be US citizens. But how could a person prove their US citizenship? This was a moment when it was still far from certain that most adults would have birth certificates, and Social Security cards had only been introduced to a portion of the population 3 years earlier. The census came to serve as a trusted source for certifications of both age and citizenship. Moriyama worried that the entire operation might buckle under the strain. He later wrote, quote, the unprecedented load imposed upon the vital statistics registration system threatened to break down the system completely. The Bureau faced hundreds of thousands of requests for proofs of age and citizenship, taxing its capacities. To get a war job, tell America. That had not been the census slogan, but in 1941, it would have been appropriate. On December 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan. Moriyama, whose parents had been born in Japan and whose brother lived there, remained a devoted Bureau officer. He served throughout the war, and in that he was far from alone. Tens of thousands of Japanese Americans fought in the European theater with the segregated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the war's most decorated combat units, and thousands more served in military intelligence in the Pacific Theater. But in 1942, the Roosevelt administration, acting without any reliable information, decided that Japanese and Japanese Americans constituted a threat to national security and would be forcibly removed from the West Coast. Those who had no other place to go were to be placed in concentration camps. Moriyama's parents narrowly escaped that fate. They lost everything they had in San Francisco, but they received permission to relocate to Washington, D.C., where they lived with their son in his lodging house room, subject to close surveillance. Moriyama's colleagues in the Census Bureau directly aided the Japanese evacuation and incarceration. Striving to stay relevant and act patriotically, Bureau officials offered to turn their statistical capacities to whatever war aims they could, including generating special tabulations showing the small areas where people lived who had been labeled Japanese by race. Those were, as far as we could tell, all statistical aggregates. They were aggregates counting very small groups. You can't really see the dots on this map, but each dot represents, I think, 10 people. With the passage of the Second War Powers Act of March 1942, it became legal for the Census Bureau to share individual data with war agencies directly. The Bureau broke its pledge to confidentiality in 1943, at a time when it was then legally allowed to do so, and it released to the FBI a list of Japanese Americans living in Washington, D.C., according to the 1930 census. The researchers Margot Anderson and William Seltzer discovered this list in 2007, and they noted an oddity in it. One of the people listed seemed to have been a late addition. He was placed on the list as number 65 and a half, and he worked for the Census Bureau. His name, it would turn out, was Iwao Moriyama. Anderson and Seltzer speculated at the time that Moriyama had been spared at first by his Bureau colleagues. They were working without the benefit of the manuscript census, which had not been released, would not be released for another 5 years in 2012. When I went back to it, though, and consulted that record to write my book, I realized that there was a different reason for Moriyama's initial absence. So here is Moriyama's census record, showing his enumeration in a lodging house packed with government workers. The enumerator working in segregated Washington, D.C. must have decided that Moriyama, living amongst people classified as white, should also be noted down as white. And indeed, this made sense. In the segregated Census Bureau offices, Moriyama worked with white colleagues. He played on the white softball team alongside a future census director. And as a result, when the Bureau tabulated all people classified as Japanese by race in DC, the printouts did not include Moriyama. One of his colleagues in the Bureau must have caught the omission and added him later. In 1947, the Second War Powers Act was repealed, affirming once again the confidentiality of census records. In 2000, the Census Bureau's director apologized for its role in aiding the Japanese removal, and the Bureau has over the decades developed new policies and review boards to prevent the release of tabulations that might be used against vulnerable groups. The story remains important, though, if for no other reason as a reminder to the keepers of our data of the harm that weaponized records can be turned to unless they or we are vigilant. So this is the final section of my talk now. Before the war came, the Bureau did manage to publish its most important statistical table. The reason that the founders called the census into existence was to facilitate the reapportionment of political power amongst the states every 10 years. State population totals serve as the basis for deciding how many seats each state should have in the House of Representatives and how many votes in the Electoral College. For most of the history of the United States, Congress had received these figures and used them to pass a new law, often one that increased the size of the House of Representatives, such that few or no states would lose any seats. That's evident if we look at this graph from the folks at usapportionment.org, which shows that the practice meant that the House tended to grow with population, albeit more slowly. That changed in 1920, when the House leadership decided that efficiency demanded freezing the House membership at 435 seats. As a result, Congress failed to pass any reapportionment law at all. Having realized at that point that it was nearly impossible to pass new legislation apportioning the House at a fixed size, Congress passed a law meant to serve as a kind of insurance that would automatically apportion the House if Congress failed to act. In 1941, that automatic backup kicked in. This was the second time it had kicked in, apportioning the House automatically. But the Democrats who were in power realized that this apportionment gave a seat to Republican-leaning Michigan that might, by using a different method, have been handed to more solidly Democratic Alabama. Congress passed a new apportionment law, installing that different method as the new default procedure it is still today, and incidentally made all future apportionments entirely automatic, essentially removed it from Congress's hands. The result is clear from this graph. The House still has only 435 seats, even as the population of the United States has tripled. Democracy has become a game of musical chairs, and each American's grasp on their Congress member has grown more and more tenuous. It was not always like this, and it need not remain so. Congress could expand the House or remove the automatic apportionment system at any time. With a bigger House, it becomes more likely that your country will know you as more than a statistic. So I'll close my lecture there, this little talk, and put up this image from the beginning of Democracy's Data that kind of gives a sense of what's happening in this book. To know America, we need to understand its data and how our shared facts are made. Thank you all very much. I'd love to have some questions and talk with y'all.
Great, thanks, Dan. I do love this, this image from the book, mainly because I feel like sometimes when I'm trying to unpack a census record for all it's worth, whole page, not just one particular family, my papers look like that sometimes. So yeah, no, that's awesome. There are a couple questions in here. The first question someone was asking, how important is the numerator, for doing research? Do we as research, should we be keeping track of these enumerators?
I mean, I suppose it does have a little to do with what it is that you're hoping to get out of it. I cannot possibly think of doing this work without trying to figure out everything I can about these enumerators. Yeah. So the first thing I do is when I find a record that I'm interested in, I look at the enumerator. I then go looking to see if I can find out who they were, where they lived, what their background is. And I think of, this might not be what you all want to hear, but when you find a record that's interesting to you, I think it's really important to read all the records around it as well. Yeah. In part because you can get a sense of each of these enumerators have their own idiosyncrasies. They have a way of seeing the world. And so you can start to pick up some of those idiosyncrasies, some of that context by reading kind of around it. I mean, you also just, I think it's interesting because it gives you a sense of the neighborhood, the community. Like our families aren't living in.
They don't live in a bubble or a vacuum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
And I
do you,
mean,
what do you do that? Do you look at the enumerators?
it depends. So if like I see something that, makes me raise some eyebrows, like, this isn't quite tracking, or maybe I have a family that was missed for a reason, and say there that this is like one African-American family in a community that is not African-American, that's like predominantly white. So I started to research, okay, so what is the background of the enumerator? Because, that person's biases can then be reflected in how the person you're researching is enumerated. So it kind of depends, not for every enumerator. I feel like I would never sleep. but
right. Yep.
but if you see something where you're like, I want a little bit more context, then yeah, for sure. There was a question about the census document you had up where you were talking about the man who was Japanese. Somebody had asked if white was listed for race, or did they list Japanese for race? I thought the Japanese was an option for the 1940 census, but then you pulled it up again. I'm like, oh, they're listed as white. That's what it looked like to me. Or was I seeing that incorrectly?
So for which, who are we talking about?
Mr. Moriyama.
For Moriyama?
Yeah.
So Japanese was an acceptable racial category. In fact, it would have been a preferred racial category probably for Moriyama. In fact, the existence of the racial category is how the Census Bureau was able to make those tabulations of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. The kind of thing that I discovered here was that Moriyama had been listed as white by this enumerator, even though the Census Bureau would have wanted him to have been classified as Japanese. But this is one of these moments, similar to the story of the Mexican Americans living in Ann Robinson's district. The enumerator has quite a lot of power in making these judgments. I mean, the thing I always say about this is that when you look at the enumerator's instructions, they are often given not just allowed, but given direct instruction that they can look at a person and try and determine what they think the appropriate race is for that person. And beyond that, if there's any question whatsoever, they're instructed to ask neighbors, like, how is this person known? So race was at that point even not understood to be a primarily biological thing, but really understood to be a social feature that one would understand best by talking to people in the community.
Someone just said in the chat, the enumerator just made stuff up. Yeah, basically, yes. The enumerator just made stuff up. I mean,
I see that's a reference to Tammy Hepps's wonderful story about Henry Silverstein, which there's a link there, and that is one of a truly terrific story. I mean, the thing about that, beyond just Tammy's wonderful story here, is census enumerators usually didn't just make things up. That is the amount of fraud is probably not quite so dramatic, but census fraud was a thing that happened enough that they had its own vocabulary, such that people would talk about curb stoning, which is when you just sat down on the curb and made up names, and it was less often about one kind of bad enumerator, one bad egg. Although Henry Silverstein, as Tammy explains, kind of he went in the wrong direction and kind of got bored or something. Who knows what happened? Most of the time, it was kind of coordinated efforts where city boosters would work with enumerators to get them to fluff up the numbers because they wanted to make their city look like it was more bumping than it actually was.
So someone, oh no, do I have to go back over all the census records again? That is a personal life choice for you. Do what you will with this.
One thing I'll say, because when I talk to people who do family history, what I've heard now from a few people, I remember talking with Tammy Hepps about this too, is that sometimes, well, it's just really important to understand that there was and remains a persistent undercount of Americans.
Yeah.
Which is to say, and so there's evidence of this from very early on, but the kind of firmest evidence is we have researchers in the Census Bureau in the 1910s, in the Segregated Census Bureau. So these were Black researchers who went back and made a convincing case, that African Americans were significantly undercounted in the 1870 and 1890 censuses. And then there's more of this kind of work, and then it's further kind of proven after the 1940 census. And the way that matters to you all is that if you're looking for somebody and you can't find them, it might be that you're having trouble finding them and there's other ways to look. It might be that they weren't enumerated, because there is a persistent undercount of people. And sometimes even when the numbers don't look so bad, like it's only a 1 or 2% undercount, that's in part because some people are duplicated.
Yeah.
And so more people are omitted in there.
Well, and, during your presentation, there were some people having conversation in the chat about people who refuse to be enumerated for one reason or another. Sometimes it's, I just don't trust the government. It was before you got to the drawing with the brass toes. And then someone else brought up an excellent point about how there was I think he said it was either a house or maybe a street where they routinely refused to be enumerated, and it was believed that the people who were living there were immigrants and they might have been undocumented. And that's something that is seen, going back to the 1930 census and earlier. So, why might these people not trust the government? I wonder why.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, no, I have a good friend who works for the Leadership Conference on Human and Civil Rights, Mita Anand, and she often says that the census is a report card for America. And what she means by that is, especially thinking about undercounts, that like to the extent to which the society was one in which everyone felt like they were fully included and that they could trust their government and trust one another, you'd have a full count. If everyone had stable housing and was in a good situation, they'd all be fully counted. Whenever we see that people aren't being counted, it's a sign of something that isn't quite going right.
Yeah, and especially, you have people not being counted, but even those who are, are they being entirely honest about certain things, like, income, for example? I know for the 1950 census, I found my husband's grandmother, showed it to my father-in-law. He's like, there's no way my mother was making that much money. She never made that much money in her life. That is factually not true. I'm like, well, why might she, kind of fudge it a little bit? Because she had some man or woman at her door asking, now, how much money do you make? It's a little patronizing. So people are gonna kind of lie a little bit. And also my grandfather, he lied about his age on the census like every single year. It was like he was the curious case of Benjamin Button. As the years go on, he's getting younger magically. Yeah.
I mean, I you used the word kind of bias earlier, thinking about enumerators, and that, and certainly in there is like an actual person's age we can figure out.
Yeah.
But this still is telling us something, right? The way in which people choose to present themselves, even if it's like, I don't think you're actually that old, is telling us something about their values or about what they're thinking and what their lives were like. We have this picture about the good old days when people trusted their neighbors and all those sorts of things. And then you look at the census sheets and you're like, maybe not. Like, because it turned out, for instance, there's this great a letter written by a widow in New Hampshire to her senator. And she's saying, I don't want the government to know how much money I made, which is $236 a year or a month, she says, to her senator. She writes to him, I know how much it was because she wrote it to her senator. So she wasn't concerned about centralization, about the federal government. She was concerned about like the nosy neighbor who was going to be the enumerator. Like that doorstep encounter could be very fraught.
For sure. We do have a couple questions left. Okay, on the census sheet with the household of Mr. Moriyama, any idea why there would have been different handwriting for the next household than seems to have reverted to the earlier handwriting after that household? So the printed letters don't seem to have the same person. So basically they're saying it looks like on the same sheet, somebody else took up a writing for a different household. Why might that be? Like the handwritings
So
apparently don't match.
in the sheets on Moriyama that I was showing earlier,
Yeah.
let me look. Oh, I see. Yeah. Right. So what's happening in that situation, where there's 3 kind of people added, is I suspect that in that case, either when they got the count at the lodging house, they were told how many total lodgers there were, but the person who was being interviewed or the people they were talking to weren't all there, and that those people were added later by someone who came back to fill it in, or that those people requested to be able to fill in their information on a private card, and then it was filled in later on, because people did have that. People who didn't want to give their income information to a person were allowed to instead fill it out on a sheet. So I think what you're seeing there is that's not that it's a new enumerator, but rather it's someone in the local office who's filling in the blanks.
Great. Sorry, I'm reading the chat. Someone is saying that they've been a census enumerator since 1990. Whenever the interview says it's taken as a response, the other person looks like Oprah Winfrey and says his name is Jack and identifies as Japanese, that's the response recorded. Yeah. I mean they give you rules, obviously, and you're supposed to follow them. And they clearly have always given rules that you're supposed to follow, but sometimes the rules don't always get followed. So I mean the census is very much a document of humanity in every sense of the way. It's trying to record data about humans, but also it's created by humans, therefore it is flawed.
And it's one of the interesting things about it is when you look at it, you'll find information about how people in your families or communities represented themselves in that circumstance, and also just tell you something about the times in which they lived and what was deemed to be a viable answer. Indeed, the modern census prioritizes self-identification when it comes to racial categories, and it's quite capacious there. But to that point, when people include certain kinds of races outside of the kind of top 5 broad categories, it's quite likely that for most tabulations, those will be edited into something else. So there's a way in which, again, like the partner, at the level of enumeration, these things can show up with people expressing themselves fully and in ways that maybe don't quite fit the instructions. But then there will be another phase where the Census Bureau is going to then shoehorn that back into some set of kind of more highly structured tables.
Cool. Okay, so final question. This person, Joseph, says, excellent, intriguing, and informative presentation. May we look forward to a future session on the 1950 census?
Oh no, you want a sequel? I like everybody else, have had quite a bit of fun trying to dig through the 1950 census. And indeed, you can go to the National Archives YouTube and you can find Elizabeth and some other great genealogies and library specialists who are looking through those 1950 records. But you're not going to get that book from me, I don't think. Sorry.
Oh, it's great. Well, thank you, Dan, for such an awesome presentation. And thanks all of you for joining us. I don't believe I see any more questions. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. And tune in on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. for another great presentation. I hope everyone has a good day. Bye.